Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening we're joined by Andy McCarthy. He's a former US Prosecutor, he's an author, he's a senior fellow at National Review Institute. Andy, thanks for joining us today.
Chris, thanks for having me.
So, law, National Review contributor, leaning kind of conservative. You just don't like people to like you? Is that what this is? Or?
Yes, it is like a triple barrel action. You're right.
And then you talk about controversial stuff on top of that. It's just not going to fare well.
Yeah, well, it's actually fared very well in the sense of if it's about self-enjoyment, I'm having a lot of fun, even if everybody isn't having a lot of fun reading it necessarily.
Well, you're giving them reasons to keep their blood pressures at proper operating levels, right, and other things,
Anything
right?
I can do to help.
So where did you learn to enjoy yourself doing this to others?
Well, you know, I always liked to write, and when I was a lawyer, that was actually my favorite part of the job. So to me, it was a natural transition, and in a lot of ways, I'm grateful for having had the litigator's background rather than a modern journalist background. I don't want to get my friends in journalism all annoyed at me, but what we have to do in...
Well, be fair. Annoy everyone is the best
Equal
way.
opportunity.
Yes, that's right.
But what we try to do in litigation, particularly trial work, is take things that are complicated and break them down so that normal people can understand them and follow them. Mm-hmm. And the only way you can really do that is, number one, to be honest, because if it turns out that what you represent doesn't get backed up by the evidence, then you're doomed. And the other thing is to try to find the major themes in stories, because people of whatever walks of life, no matter how complicated things are, if you give them a story that's wedded to the core facts of whatever the fact pattern is, they'll be able to follow it.
Well, and also going ahead and presenting a compelling argument.
Right.
A lot of times, journalism's known for projecting opinions, but how compelling it is, how well it's argued, and everything sometimes does fall by the wayside just in an attempt to just tick people off without necessarily, as you said, using fact. You're talking about facts in journalism, and that's something that's near and dear to a lot of our hearts.
Well, yeah, and the other thing about that's interesting is, in the culture I came from, if you misrepresent something, whether it's an error or worse, you hope it's never worse. But if you make a mistake, and it happens to everyone, you are expected to go in and confess error. So, you know, if I make a misrepresentation in a bail argument and somebody ends up in jail rather than getting bail, the minute I find out I was wrong, I have to get myself to court and correct that, even if it makes me look foolish. Mm-hmm. I think journalism could be helped by that culture, because I think there's a lot of clinging to places where you plant your feet, and it turns out when the facts get developed, you were wrong. There's a lot of rationalizing rather than just saying, okay, I screwed that one up.
Well, but it also comes to me that you're actually having that legal background. It's not just about taking responsibility for yourself. You've come to the realization that lives truly are on the line, and people can be punished for a very long time for you not doing your job correctly, and that is something I think that journalism needs to understand as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, but I also think there's something to be said for the idea that we all make mistakes, mm-hmm. and when you make them, confess error. It's not the end of the world, and what people remember in the end is the person who fesses up and says, I got it wrong. Where you lose your credibility, I think, is by clinging to things that make less and less sense as time goes on.
Yeah. And honor is also just, I mean, it's a beautiful thing.
Yep.
So one of the things that you're very well known for currently is the threat of Islam, radical Islam, if you like. How did you go down that path? Where does it come from, being a federal prosecutor and covering things journalistically generally after the transition, but where does Islam come in for you?
Well, you know, I was in my office minding my business one day, and the World Trade Center got bombed about 6 blocks away from our office in the U.S. Attorney's office in New York. And I was eventually asked to take over the investigation, because what we learned was not only that they had carried out this bombing, but that they were planning a second plot, which was a simultaneous bombing of a group of New York City landmarks. So there was one case already on the World Trade Center, and it was impossible for the lawyers who had that to get ready for trial and run an investigation at the same time. I had done a lot of international mafia and narcotics cases. We, back in 1993, really didn't have a template for how you do an international terrorism case. But I guess my experience was as close as whatever we had. So that was the reason I ended up asked to take over the investigation, and it was a life-altering event.
It's interesting. I'm wondering how they made that thread from things like the mafia to terrorism. Is it families from foreign countries? What happened?
Actually, from the law enforcement perspective, and it's interesting how this unfolds, because the big debate afterwards became, is this really a law enforcement problem? But when the bombing happened, it turned out that the wheels of law enforcement went into motion. So it's not like a bunch of people sat around a table and said, is this a crime or is it an act of war? A bombing happened, first responders jumped in, the police jumped in, the FBI jumped in, and the next thing you know, you have people in custody, and then the clock starts to tick and you have to indict them, and you're off to the races.
Momentum.
Right, exactly, because the system does have a momentum. And I guess from a law enforcement perspective, it wasn't so much that terrorist organizations are like mafia families or drug cartels, because they're not.
Right.
But there is a certain skill and familiarity involved with dealing with foreign governments and foreign authorities, and when you're trying to collect evidence and have those relationships, that turns out to be important.
And understanding the reach and how to get out and get the information while it's still credible.
Right. And of course, it turns out then, by that familiarity, if you're being honest, you quickly realize that this system is not geared for terrorism.
Right.
Because the people who plot against the United States, but for the handful, relatively speaking, who happen to be here, the people who are here are usually not the major players. They're overseas. Right. And they turn out to be in places, some of which are ungovernable, all of which are in places where neither the writ of our courts run nor do our agencies operate. And as a result, you quickly realize that if you go down the list of all the big terrorists, why did we get them? We didn't get them because we put handcuffs on them in a traditional criminal case. I think bin Laden was under indictment for about 13, 14 years when he finally was gotten in a military operation.
Yeah, the military is the one that typically uncovers them.
Right. So, you can argue about whether it's a war or a crime, but the reality of the situation actually catches up to you after a while.
Right. And so what was it about that case that was life-altering for you? You use those terms. What does that mean? Well,
first of all, for a lawyer to have a case like that, which at the time was one of the most, for better or worse, one of the most important cases in the country, and I was in charge of it. So it was, right. Most lawyers would, cut their arm off for that. And there's good and bad that goes with that. The bad is probably what happens to your family while they worry about you. But for a lawyer, it's kind of like, if you're a pitcher, you want to be in the 7th game of the World Series. And in our world, that's what this is.
And this actually includes the World versus the World Series, which is more right. Localized.
Yes, it was the world, civilization, just those kind of trivial things.
Higher stakes.
But I guess the other thing that's more serious and enduring is that everything that was important to that case and everything that was worth understanding that came out of it is the nub of our most immediate national security problem, and has continued to be for just about, I hate to say this, a quarter of a century. And we were the first people to grapple with it, which meant, there's good and bad that comes out of that
right.
as well. But I think being forced to be on the front line of it, so to speak, when it first happened and when we were dealing with it as a law enforcement problem, forced me to understand it in a way that if I had been just an observer in the peanut gallery or a journalist, it wouldn't have been the same.
Or worse yet, someone who's taking a feed from a journalist who may not have the information in the first place.
Right, right.
So what was it well, first of all, you're acknowledging at that point you knew it was a security threat. How much have we evolved as a country, or even as a world, if you want to cover it at that level, in being able to effectively identify and reduce that security threat then versus now?
I'd say we've devolved, because in 1993, when we didn't have an understanding of what the problem was, what the challenge was, and when it emerged that it was ideological and rooted in a religious doctrine, it was something we didn't want to accept, didn't want to grapple with. And I think it's irresponsible not to grapple with reality when it smacks you in the face, but at the same time, we didn't have 25 years worth of terrorism to rely on. We were dealing with something brand new.
It was new to us.
Right.
Other parts of the world had been experiencing
Correct.
things.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. But, you know, here we are. I mean, that's they really planted their flag here around 1990, actually a little bit earlier than that. We're in 2016 now, and we're making the same exact mistakes that we made back then. And in fact, I think in some ways, we're even more aggressive about willful blindness, about not wanting to see what's actually causing the thing that is the biggest threat to America at the moment.
Other than our current elections and...
I'm talking about the things that we could actually do something about.
Oh, yeah, because that's completely out of control.
Right.
So it's interesting, though, you talk about willful blindness, and yes, there was terrorism that was occurring previously, but because it was new to us, we were only interpreting the bubble that was closest to us. Right. And now it seems that even the media coverage is starting to acknowledge more of the global threat of this flavor of terrorism. How is that affecting U.S. views or impressions of what's going on, or is it, from your perspective?
I don't think it's affecting the government's view of it.
Or even the citizenry?
But I actually think the citizenry is in many ways ahead of the government in saying, you know, look, you don't need to be politically correct with us. You can level with us about what this is we're dealing with, it because we're living with the fallout of it. So I think you have this sort of struggle, and I would put involved in this also the agents and the police who are on the front lines of dealing with the threat, as opposed to the people who are back in Washington and headquarters making policy. So I think the people who are dealing with the immediacy of mass murder attacks are saying, just be straight with us, and let's get to the root of what this is about. And the government, as it was doing back in 1993, other than in the four corners of our little courtroom in New York, is still trying to construct a sort of a fantasy Islam that, from what I can detect, doesn't have any content other than it's relentlessly peaceful. Other than that, I don't know what doctrines it follows. And it's all based on, I think, a farcical notion that we non-Muslims can define a true peaceful Islam, and somehow, by force of our taking that position, marginalize all the militant elements in Islam, as if they judge themselves by our values and our judgments. And you think somebody at a certain point would say, well, you know, if they regard us as their mortal enemies who have to be conquered, maybe they're not using us as their barometer for what's good. You know? But in point of fact, they have their own value system, they have their own civilization, they have their own culture, and they don't care what we think. So this whole idea of, you know, let's define the true Islam, and that way we'll marginalize them or create some, you know, current within the Islamic community that'll turn against them, is, I think, foolish and completely beside the point in terms of what solid national security policy would be.
So they're not complying with the help that they're receiving for rebranding.
Yeah, can you imagine?
And yeah, that's craziness. We're saying you're nice, just be nice and it's okay. You don't have to kill us anymore. Yeah. Interesting perspective on
but, you know, it's not rocket science. It really is the same problem. It was an interesting dynamic back even in 1993, because we would basically, as a government, whether it was in the White House or in Main Justice down in Washington, or even on the steps of the courthouse at times, you would hear government officials who became apologists for Islam. And you know, I don't want to wrap Islam, because Islam is complicated. The fact of the matter is, even with that particular case, the first Muslims I met were not terrorists. They were the people who were helping us infiltrate the terrorist networks, without whom we could not have stopped attacks. So there's very much two sides to this story. However, what we were able to prove in the trial, because you have to, in a criminal trial, convince the jury not only of what happened, but why it happened. So we're able to show them that there's a straight, linear, logical connection between commands to violence in the doctrine, mediating figures like the Blind Sheik, who was the main defendant, who was an inspirational character in that world, and the people who he radicalized and inspired to commit terrorist attacks. So there actually is a line, and it is unfortunately rooted in a fundamentalist, literalist interpretation of the doctrine. Now, if you went anywhere else in the U.S. government, you would not have gotten that. But in our courtroom, nobody stopped us. There was no political correctness. It was what the evidence was.
And it was kept relatively quiet outside of your courtroom.
Well, yeah, there was a little thing going on at exactly the same time as our trial that kind of took attention away. It was called the O.J. Simpson case. But oddly, almost day for day, we were on trial at the same time as the O.J. Simpson case. So I guess in most of America, they thought that's what a trial looks like. But I can assure you it wasn't. So,
but how has terrorism evolved since then? Before we saw the big scale attacks, we were very concerned that what if this happens again? Now we're seeing these other instances of workplace violence where it's just a lone wolf. It's not a plot. Sure, they're empathetic to these the sheiks that are declaring war on the infidels, etc. But they're just, it's not organized anymore. It's just individuals. There's no threat. This is the B team. Why is it evolving, or is it just a media ploy to say, oh, you're not really a threat except for just individuals who could disintegrate you? Well,
you know, it's a great question. In a way, it's evolving because there's more of it. You know, if we've learned one thing, it should be that if you give these guys time and space to operate, they will conduct attacks. And if you look at ISIS, which is really just Al-Qaeda 2.0, it's actually a breakaway faction of Al-Qaeda. And by the way, that doesn't mean Al-Qaeda's gone away. So Al-Qaeda's resurgent, and you have this ISIS, which now controls territory. I mean, it goes up and down. But at one point in 2014, they controlled more territory than Great Britain. And they governed about 9 million people within their territory. So we know that when they have the space to operate, they can conduct attacks. Conducting attacks, contrary to what you hear out of Washington, and giving people the sense that they have a chance to win is actually the biggest recruiting tool that they have. And they're on the doorstep of Europe at a time when they're basically, when we have a migrant crisis that's overrunning Europe. So the way the threat has evolved is they're still looking to carry out the big attacks like Al-Qaeda always did, but now they're going after the low-hanging fruit, which is the kind of stuff that we always worried that they would do, and now it seems they'll do. And since it's tried to say this, but the purpose of terrorism is to terrorize, all these small attacks, even where people don't get killed. You know, someone goes after somebody on a train in Germany with a machete. They don't kill anyone, but, you know, makes everybody who gets on a train in Germany a little bit more worried.
Right.
And that's what kills liberty eventually.
Right, because people are willing to give up their rights in order to not feel like they're going to be afraid, but there's no way to really stop the fear because it could come from anywhere.
Correct, and that's what they're banking on.
Right. And so you talked about the idea that trying to rebrand Islam and trying to really define what it is, and that it's all good, it's all peace, it's not a problem, and it's just a few crazy people, isn't the effective way to solve this problem. Do you have any ideas of what might be the effective way to solve the problem?
I really think the formula for winning And I want to win. I don't want to contain it. I want to win. I know that's radical.
It's very intolerant.
Yeah.
To win?
Yeah. About 5 minutes ago, that's what America used to want to do.
Just have a participation trophy and be done with it.
Right. Everybody gets it.
Everybody wins.
Right.
Yeah, everybody wins.
Maybe they'll be happy with a trophy. Right.
Yeah.
Well, but you know, President Bush announced a policy about a week after the 9/11 attacks, which I think is still the right policy. Now, it's very difficult to implement, but it's simple, it's straightforward, and it's right. And that is, wherever jihadists operate in the world, without geographical limitation, you have to deny them space. You have to attack them militarily. You're not going to bring them around. We're not going to have an armistice with them. They have to be killed or captured. States, countries that facilitate terrorists have to be treated as if they're hostiles. That doesn't mean we have to invade every country, but we have to use every lever of government to squeeze them until they either change their policy or we get regime change. And the one addendum I would add that President Bush didn't have in that Bush doctrine is we have to understand the depth of the threat. So behind the jihadists are just the front line. They want to implement Sharia by violence. Behind them, there's a civilizational threat, a kind of a stealth jihad that's based on the idea of Sharia encroachment, where they want to win the battle culturally, in the legal system, among the opinion elites, etc. That needs to be combated ideologically.
So you do recommend military might, not just strongly worded letters? That's not going to be enough to solve the problem?
Well, because it takes so much time to translate them into Arabic. You might as well,
nuances of the translation may not be as harsh as we intended.
Right.
Well, any other thoughts on just how great, looking at it from all of these different angles, anything else that you want to leave us with to ponder? We've got like a minute left.
I think we can't overlook the civilizational jihad.
Okay.
We want to focus on the jihadists, which is understandable because they're the immediate threat. But the cauldrons in which radicalization occurs, and where you have recruitment and fundraising and inspiration to jihad, are these areas that become Sharia enclaves. And unless we deal with that, we're going to be dealing with terrorism that falls out from it for a long time.
Okay. And so I'm sure there are going to be people that have questions or who would love to just argue with you.
Right.
What's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Well, my website is andrewcmccarthy.com. I write at National Review regularly. We have a wonderful website with terrific writers, nationalreview.com. And I'm out there on Twitter, although I try not to be too often, because if you start, it's hard to get off, Yeah,
whirlwind. And your Twitter handle is?
Andrew C. McCarthy, at Andrew C. McCarthy.
Well, thanks for joining us. If you'll hold on for just a moment, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum.
Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit in a small room. In fact, when the Conservative Forum was founded in 2003, we did meet in a small room, a coffee shop in San Jose. It doesn't get more grassroots than this. It may surprise you that there are thousands of people right here in Silicon Valley who share your principles of liberty, free markets, and limited government. Since our humble beginnings in that coffee shop, we've outgrown 3 meeting halls. From San Jose to Gilroy to Mill Valley, we bring hundreds of people together each month from all over the Bay Area to promote the principles of American liberty. How do we do it? It starts with a stellar lineup of speakers. Speakers like Steve Forbes, Senator Jim DeMint, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson, Lieutenant Colonel Alan West, Andrew Breitbart, Pamela Geller, and many others. These speakers passionately articulate our shared principles and remind us why conservatism isn't just the smart choice, it's also the moral choice. Our monthly meetings are only one dimension of the forum. We underwrite The Right Side, a monthly television show on cable access channel KMVT. We also host a monthly Constitution discussion group and provide tables at our meetings for more than a dozen local groups who share our love of liberty to promote their specific cause. The Conservative Forum is the premier place in Silicon Valley for conservatives to gather, become invigorated, motivated, and empowered. We welcome guests to our monthly meetings and offer special discounted pricing to first-time visitors. Take a look at our speaker lineup in the coming months and join us to learn why we say liberty is made in America. Some people think that a meeting of conservatives in Silicon Valley could fit.
And that was a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum. And we appreciate them immensely. They've made this show possible for the last 4 seasons, and now this is the 5th. But what they're really best known for is their speaker series. And that occurs the second Tuesday, typically, of each month at the IFES Portuguese Hall at 432 Stearland Road here in Mountain View, about 3 minutes from the studio. And their speaker series is the reason we were actually able to bring Andy in this evening to share. But in September, Cam Edwards, the host of NRA News and Cam and Company, will be joining us. In October, it'll be Dinesh D'Souza, a renowned author, speaker, and filmmaker, and I can almost guarantee that is going to be a packed house that night, so you may want to look into that early. And in November, Dr. Charlie Self, who we've had on the show, is an inspirational speaker. A frequent guest is Dr. History on KSFO. He'll be joining the Conservative Forum for that event. So if you need more information on what's coming up at the forum, I encourage you to look at theconservativeforum.com for more info about registrations, upcoming speakers, etc. But in closing this evening, I think it's important to kind of let some of the things that Andy shared with us this evening be pondered a little bit more deeply. We have all of the sensationalism about what Islam is and what it isn't, about who's safe and who isn't, about what's workplace violence versus a terrorist attack. But Andy's actually seen things from the inside and brings a different perspective that I personally enjoyed and learned a lot from, and I'm sure you did as well. But again, to learn more about him, you'll want to check out andrewcmccarthy.com or reach out to the National Review website, research more, and reach out to him with questions that you may have. Throw flaming darts. He's assured me he can handle it. And just learn more about whether your perspectives are on, off, or need to be grown. We thank you for joining us this evening, and we look forward to visiting with you again either here or on the show sometime soon. But if you just can't wait, you can also reach out to us at therightside@gmail.com. We appreciate you joining us, and this has been Chris Pareja on The Right Side. See you again soon.